Hello class. Today we're going to continue on looking at the Reconstruction part of the Civil War. Remember, the Civil War tore the nation in two. The North was more industrial and economically. The South was left in ruins. Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865. The remaining Confederate armies were surrendered shortly after. The country now faced the difficult task of moving forward after being so deeply divided. Reconstruction and Lincoln. The first amendment that will get added concerning Reconstruction is going to be the 13th Amendment. In January 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery in the United States. Lincoln seemed to favor bringing Southern states back into the Union quickly. He promised malice towards none with charity for all. He had what was called the 10% plan. Once 10% of voters from a rebellious state swore an oath of allegiance, that state could be readmitted to the Union. Those states could then draft new state constitutions. He also issued pardons. Pardons would be given to Southerners who supported the Confederacy, except high-ranking officials. Lincoln would protect Southerners' property, except slaves. So he basically said, if you return, you can still keep your plantations, you can keep all your land, you just cannot keep the slaves. States would be required to ratify, and that means to approve, the 13th Amendment. Before Lincoln went through the whole Reconstruction process, he was actually assassinated. So many in Congress believe Lincoln was too lenient on the rebels and called for much harsher punishments. These are the radical Republicans. Because of Lincoln's death on April 15, 1865, his plans for Reconstruction never came to be. Lincoln was shot and killed by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater just 5 days after Lee surrendered to Grant. So his vice president, Andrew Johnson, will become the next president after Lincoln's death. He was a Southern Democrat. He was actually born in Raleigh. From humble beginnings, Johnson remained loyal to the Union during the war. Johnson was a white supremacist. He did not believe in equal rights for blacks, but he despised the Southern landowners involved in starting the Civil War. So his Reconstruction plan was pardons were given to ex-Confederates who supported the Union. If they were large landowners or officials, they had to receive a special pardon. And remember, pardon means to be forgiven of your crimes. State conventions were held, all white delegates to draft new state constitutions. And also the state, again, must ratify the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. Different organizations were created to help African Americans integrate into the society. You're going to have the Freedmen's Bureau, which the Freedmen's Bureau was created in 1865 to help former slaves, freedmen, and whites transition from slavery to freedom. They issued food and clothing, provided legal representation. They operated hospitals and temporary camps. They promoted education. They settled the freedmen on abandoned or confiscated lands, like lands that they took away from like Confederates. They gave to the new freedmen. Despite the 13th Amendment, Southerners passed what was called black codes to restrict African Americans' freedom. These laws limit the freedom of free blacks to travel freely. They could be arrested and forced to work and convicted of fragrancy, and carried harsher punishments for blacks convicted of crime. So they still wanted to keep them inferior. Remember, they were upset that they actually gained their freedom. You will have these radical Republicans that did not agree with the leniency that the Confederates was being shown. So you're going to have radical Reconstruction. Congress is outraged at Johnson's Reconstruction plan. Many believe the South was returning to its old ways. To ensure blacks were protected under the law, Congress passed the Freedmen's Bureau bill to extend the benefits of the Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Radical Republicans led by Thaddeus Stevens moved to pass laws abolishing state government set up by Johnson, creating military districts commanded by an army officer, and punishing ex-Confederates and reward states that allowed blacks voting rights. And this is a map that shows like date of readmission to the Union, date of defeat of radical Reconstruction government, and then military district boundaries. And this is like the Confederate states. So you're going to have the Carpetbaggers and the Scalawags. The Carpetbaggers were basically Northerners who went south during Reconstruction. Southerners saw these people as exploitative and taking advantage of misfortune of the South, so they didn't like them. The Scalawags were Southern whites who supported the Republican Reconstruction efforts. And keep in mind, these are going to be individuals that support Reconstruction. So several other amendments will be added. We already had the 13th, and then the 14th is going to be your Citizenship Amendment, and the 15th is going to give African American males the right to vote. Johnson's actually is going to get impeached by the radical Republicans. Johnson attempted to remove cabinet members and officials who were sympathetic to radical Reconstruction. When Johnson tried to fire Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, the House impeached him for violating the Tenure of Office Act. Johnson was not convicted, but by the Senate, they were short by only one vote. So keep in mind, the House will bring the charges, and the Senate, they act as like the trial. Well, they act as the jury in the trial to find guilt or innocent, and Johnson was not convicted only by one vote. So Southern society, Congress passed law and amended the Constitution, approved conditions for blacks, but the sharecropping system allowed blacks to rent and work land on credit, which was borrowed. Sharecroppers will give a portion of the crop every year to the landowner as payment. System often resulted in poor farmers accumulating debt. Many slaves were trapped on the same plantations where they were slaves. So it was just another form of labor. And they didn't get paid a lot for it, so it was really similar to slavery because they still stayed, most of them stayed and worked on the same plantations that they were slaves on. The period also saw the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, a terrorist group that attacked blacks and Republicans. African Americans were elected to state and national governments for the first time, and black colleges arose in the South. If you look at North Carolina has several historical black colleges and universities that comes from this. Shaw University in downtown Raleigh was actually the first HBCU to be created, and that's Historical Black College and University coming out of Reconstruction. You have North Carolina Central University, St. Augustine. It's a lot. North Carolina A&T, those are all HBCUs. So how did Reconstruction end? Distractions, westward expansion, the KKK violence, the Indian Wars, because they're still fighting against the Indians, corruption, and financial panic led to the radical Republicans losing their influence in the South. A group of Southern Democrats called the Redeemers took control in the South. Rutherford B. Hayes compromised with Democrats and the last federal troops from the South in 1877. Methods were reinstated to ensure the gains made by African Americans were reversed. So some will argue that Reconstruction actually was a failure because it was a compromise with Hayes and Tilden. Hayes was like, if y'all let me become president, I will remove all federal troops out of the South and bring them back up north. So once you remove that federal protection, you remove those federal troops, the African Americans don't have anybody to protect them anymore. So the South will return to as it was before the Northerners went in there and try to reconstruct it. And that's the end of Reconstruction.